Coming Together, Coming Apart, Episode 6, Maketh the Horse Fat. Today's episode is part 2 of the accidental two-part story we started last week. Then, we were talking about the first months of the Soviet occupation in northern Korea, pretty much from August to December 1945. Today, we'll talk about the same thing on the American side of the 38th parallel. We'll start by catching up with our friend Douglas MacArthur before talking specifically about the American actions once they arrived in Korea in early September. We will finish today by discussing the December 1945 meeting of Allied Ministers of State in Moscow and its aftermath. Last we saw him, Douglas MacArthur was standing aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, receiving the official instruments of Japanese surrender to end the Second World War. MacArthur, as you remember, was a vain, arrogant, and self-centered man. President Harry Truman himself referred to MacArthur as Mr. Prima Donna before appointing him Supreme Commander Allied Powers, giving him total control of the American occupation of Japan. He rejected just about every effort by the other allies to take part in the occupation. That's not all on him. Stanley Weintraub writes that quote-unquote diluting American power in Japan was unpopular with Truman and the State Department as well, but MacArthur was particularly brash about it. When asked if foreign liaison officers would take part in the occupation, MacArthur responded that they could do so only with his approval of each officer individually. This surprised the Soviets, as it was their understanding from discussions at Potsdam that Japan, like Germany, would be subject to a joint occupation. When the Americans refused, the Soviets prepared a landing force to take the northernmost home island in the last week of August. This operation was called off at the last minute due to Stalin's strong desire to maintain the cooperative spirit of the Grand Alliance for as long as possible after war's end. Such an invasion would not make for a warm atmosphere at future conferences between the two powers. It also helped that the U.S. Navy had a large presence in and around the Japanese home islands. The surrender ceremony, as originally planned, was to take place in Tokyo Bay on August 31st, but was then pushed back to the 1st, then the 2nd, of September. 258 American and Allied ships were in Tokyo Bay, an incredible display of force that was probably as shocking as the arrival of Commodore Perry 90 years earlier. As the Japanese delegates signed the documents, 400 B-29 Superfortress bombers and 1,500 naval aircraft roared overhead. MacArthur never let an opportunity to impress and terrify go to waste. Now, MacArthur would have to govern. The document setting out American goals and mechanisms for the early stage of the occupation of Japan was published on September 22nd and basically stated that any disagreement between allies as it concerned the occupation would be decided by the United States. MacArthur had finally achieved the power he had wanted all along. Before that, though, peace with Japan would lead to violence across the region. Violence would continue in China, Southeast Asia, and the islands of the Malay Archipelago, and, soon enough, Korea. Many people found a common enemy in the Japanese, and now that Japan had surrendered, they could get back to fighting each other. We might talk about some of those conflicts in the future. If any are of particular interest, please let me know through the contact form on our website. As MacArthur settled into his post in Tokyo, General John Hodge prepared to depart from Okinawa for Korea. As commander of the 14th Corps of the U.S. 10th Army, Hodge was the commanding general of the newly minted United States Armed Forces in Korea, or USAFIK. USAFIK is not a fun acronym though, so we'll just call them the hodgepodge for now. Hodge was not supposed to be the original commander of the hodgepodge. That was to be General Joe Stilwell, who had made a name for himself fighting alongside Chinese forces in mainland China. But just as his men were preparing to make the trip from Okinawa to Korea, the 14th Corps was removed from Stilwell's 10th Army and placed under MacArthur's direct command. You may or may not know Stilwell better by his common nickname, Vinegar Joe. Vinegar Joe was an effective commander, but he was also personally abrasive and unliked by Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the Chinese Republicans. Chiang cabled Washington that he did not like Stilwell and did not want him in command of any further American presence in mainland Asia. So the 14th Corps was shifted from Vinegar Joe to Emperor Douglas, who then gave Hodge the command. Bruce Cummings writes that, generally speaking, Hodge had the better qualities of Stilwell, like his fighting spirit, his bluntness, and his popularity among those he commanded, wrapped in a more respectable package. His biggest weakness in this moment was that, to quote Cummings, unlike Stilwell, Hodge had no experience with Asian culture or politics. Like its Soviet counterparts in the 25th Army, There was nothing specific about the 14th Corps that made it exceptionally well suited to administer the occupation of Korea except for its ability to quickly arrive on the peninsula. This was basically how all military occupations were done in the immediate aftermath of the war. Securing control and re-establishing order were the primary goals, even if order was never broken in the transition. The order to occupy Korea up to the 38th parallel was handed down to the 14th Corps on August 11th, just after the agreement with the Soviets was reached. Again, though, no one really knew if the Soviets meant what they said. As they were preparing to embark, there was a great deal of uncertainty about what they would find once they landed in Korea. This uncertainty was not helped by the constantly shifting date of departure. First, the date of entry for the Corps was set as VJ Day plus 27, putting it sometime in mid to late September, which then moved to September 11th, then to September 7th, then to September 4th. The group that would arrive on the 4th was to be, in Hodge's words, a small advance party, to prepare for the arrival of the full hodgepodge. As we discussed in episode 4, the Japanese, between their surrender and the American arrival, were reaching out to the Americans with news of the chaos wracking Korea. It was mostly a load of bunk that the Americans only partially believed, for now at least. It was certainly not the reason for moving up the entry date. That was done in reaction to the swift Soviet advance through Manchuria and northern Korea. Remember, the Soviets were already in Pyongyang by the middle of August. The Americans had not even gotten their ducks in a row about their occupation. So the date of entry kept getting moved closer and closer. Hodge's orders for the initial move into Korea stated that he should push back against the Soviets if they were to overstep the previously agreed bounds. They didn't, but here we see the reasoning for an American occupation of Korea in the first place, up to this point, start to break down. The occupation was no longer about tutoring the Koreans under trusteeship, it was about limiting Soviet influence over the future government of Korea. Just as the Soviets had a few questions hanging over the early days of their occupation, so too did the Americans. First, and you would think this is a basic question, but here we are, were Koreans friend or foe? Up until August 1945, Koreans were described as enslaved and oppressed by the Japanese, which is not the language you would use to describe an enemy. MacArthur himself directed the hodgepodge to treat Koreans as a liberated people friendly to the Americans. Hodge, for some unknown reason, stated in his orders that Koreans were to be treated as a defeated enemy of the United States, setting up the occupation as one would in a place that more actively resisted the Allied powers than had Korea. This is probably because of two reasons. One, Hodge was a career warfighter who was involved in some of the most difficult campaigns of the Pacific Theater, and he now struggled to get away from that mindset. And two, the Japanese warnings of chaos were finally being heard, even though they were almost entirely false and centered around the Japanese experience in Korea and not the efforts of Koreans to effectively govern themselves. The Japanese remnants of the Government General of Korea were trying to exploit the US Army's conservative tendencies and lack of knowledge about Korea to their gain. In response to a message from Japanese Lieutenant General Kazuki Yoshio about the allegedly high likelihood of open revolt in Korea, Hodge directed Kazuki to, quote, maintain order and preserve the existing machinery of government in Korea. Somehow, Koreans were now the enemy, and the Japanese were the ally. This was just the first instance of a terrible habit of Hodge to disregard the sentiments in Washington for his own, often flawed and poorly informed, assessment of the situation. In what Bruce Cummings calls the supreme irony of post-war East Asia, Korea was the location of the occupation intended for Japan. Division and hostile occupation was a more suitable response for Japan's aggression, but it is the last act of Japanese colonialism that Korea received a much more violent and costly fate than the Japanese after the war. All of the plans made for the Japanese occupation were just transferred to Korea. The officers trained in Japanese language and culture, as well as the best practices of military government, were sent to Seoul instead of Tokyo. Now, these officers did have an expansive planning and informational document they could consult to shore up these weaknesses, but that one document could not make up for all the classes and situational knowledges those officers had of Japan, but did not have about Korea. They would have to govern more or less by the seat of their pants. American boots hit the ground in Korea on September 8th with the arrival of the hodgepodge in Incheon, west of Seoul. Things were off to a rocky start on the 8th before the Americans even disembarked, as Japanese police killed 2 Koreans earlier in the day. Upon arrival, Hodge saw fit to further stir the pot, speaking of the continued control of the Japanese police force in highly congratulatory terms. On the 9th, the Americans moved into Seoul and accepted the formal surrender of Japanese forces in Korea. Korea was finally free. But not really. Immediately after the surrender ceremony, Hodge announced that the entire existing apparatus of the GGK would stay in place for the time being. Even the Japanese Governor General would stay in his post. This was a big mistake from Hodge in the eyes of Koreans, but what could they do about it? The Americans and the Japanese were much stronger in their capacity to inflict violence. Hodge made this decision entirely on his own, as later statements from both MacArthur and the State Department expressed their frustration with Hodge in keeping the former enemy of the United States in powerful positions in Korea. Hodge would realize his mistake just 3 days later, but did not want to change it for fear of provoking chaos in Korea. Cummings gives 2 potential reasons for Hodge's initial decision and reticence on reversing the ill-conceived policy. 1. MacArthur was pretty much doing the same thing in Japan, keeping the domestic bureaucracy in place under the executive authority of his office. And 2. The Korean People's Republic could easily hoover up any administrative power GGK had and make the occupation's job that much harder. Now, I don't think that second point is a bad thing, but clearly Hodge thought differently. Slowly, Hodge complied with MacArthur's wishes and replaced high-ranking Japanese officials with American counterparts. The overall structure remained the same, though. The only thing that changed was the nationality of those in the upper reaches of the hierarchy. Functionally, the hodgepodge just placed itself at the top of the GGK. Even after their removal, former Japanese officials maintained close ties with their American replacements. Cummings cites 350 individual memos from former GGK officials to the hodgepodge in the 3 months after their surrender as evidence that relationships between American and Japanese officials were well formed before the hodgepodge really attempted to build working relationships with Korean leaders. One of the first Korean attempts to build a relationship with the hodgepodge occurred on the morning the Americans arrived in Incheon. 3 men were taken aboard Hodge's command ship on the 8th, claiming to represent the Committee for the Preparation of Korean Independence. One of these men was Yo Un-yong's brother, Yo Un-hong, giving the 3 some credibility to their claims. They brought with them 2 lists, one containing names of pro-Japanese Koreans, and the other containing allegedly trustworthy Koreans. The second list is much more interesting and clarifies the true intentions of Yo and his friends. On this list, just over half were members of the Korean Democratic Party. Remember, the KDP was the party formed as a coalition of conservative and traditional elites whose sole purpose was to work against the KPR. Only 3 liberal KPR leaders were named on this list, and some of the biggest names in the KPR were left off. Furthermore, Yo Un-hong himself collaborated with the Japanese, but was still included on the second list of trustworthy Koreans. Although Hodge would later deny it, these men did meet with the general that day. Whether or not the meeting had the impact intended by the 3 men, Hodge would come to similar conclusions within the first few days of the occupation about who the trustworthy Koreans were and who the revolutionary Koreans were. This was, of course, helped along by the fact that almost all of the Koreans the hodgepodge worked with in the first few weeks were KDP members. They argued against the KPR, calling it communistic and a Japanese puppet. Weirdly enough, the Japanese were also saying to the Americans that the KPR was communistic and not to be trusted. That's a funny thing to say about your own puppet. This was all false, but it fit neatly into the anti-communist desires of the Americans and painted a more simplistic view of Korea that meshed well with the lack of knowledge the hodgepodge had about Korea. I don't know if the Americans trusted the Japanese or the KDP more, but the end result is the same. The Americans would not support any legitimate claim to authority by the KPR. While the hodgepodge were buying the KDP Japanese story, it took Yo Un-yong a full month to finally meet with Hodge. At this meeting, Hodge was overly antagonistic to Yo, accusing him of pro-Japanese sentiments. When we discussed the KPR and the KDP in episode 4, we talked about how the KPR was popular with Koreans of moderate and liberal tendencies and deeply unpopular with conservative Koreans. The opposite was true for the KDP. The only thing that could ensure the KDP would have any power in an independent Korea was for them to convince the Americans that they were the legitimate rulers of Korea. that they were the most popular group in Korean politics, and that the KPR hijacked the will of the Korean people. This, of course, was all bunk. The KPR was very popular and contained a broad coalition of moderates, some conservatives, and communists. The conservatives cried that the KPR was not representative, even though they were included in its leadership roster. They just actively chose not to participate in the process of building a democracy. Reading directly from page 100 of Cummings' Origins of the Korean War, Volume 1, because I cannot find any better words to say this. When the Americans arrived in Korea in September of 1945, they found revolutionaries who posited their right to rule on the charismatic basis of resistance to the Japanese, and conservatives who based their claim to legitimacy and tradition. They had ruled before, and they could rule now, if the Americans would have them. High-ranking officials in the hodgepodge, including Colonel Cecil Nist and State Department Advisor H. Merrill Benioff, took the easy route and accepted the KDP's claims to both popular legitimacy and democratic ideals at face value without any further interrogation. They even admitted that the KDP had members that collaborated with the Japanese, but their response was basically that, at some point, other Koreans would just have to get over it. Within 3 weeks, the view from within the hodgepodge had changed considerably from one of disregard to the KPR to one that was actively anti-KPR and pro-KDP. This is shown by Benioff's dispatches back to Washington. On the 15th of September, he paints the KDP as both a massive popular organization and a small, non-majority group of elites. On the 29th, he describes Korea as ripe for agitators, and that deep infiltration by the Soviets was unknown but highly likely. He also continuously put forth the Korean Provisional Government as the only body with a legitimate claim to authority, and advocated for Syngman Rhee's return. Benioff then reassured his superiors back home that the hodgepodge was remaining aloof of Korean political developments, which was not at all true. Any military occupation is inherently political. As a matter of governance, it will have to make political decisions that will have ramifications in both the short and long term. The hodgepodge also supported the KDP's anti-KPR efforts. And multiple times in official meetings and in communications over the official radio station, hodgepodge officials gave their implied approval of anti-KPR messages propagated by KDP leaders. 1 week after Benioff's last letter, the military governor, Major General Archibald Arnold, invited 11 Koreans to join his advisory council. One was Cho Man-sik, who did not partake because he was busy up in Pyongyang. Another was Yo Un-yong, who refused to participate because it would, and I quote, reverse the fact of who is guest and who is host in Korea. The other 9 were members of the KDP, 4 of them being organizers of the party. The Americans were not even trying to hide their pro-KDP stance at this point. The KDP still was not popularly supported except by the Americans. To further drive home this point, Arnold called the KPR leadership childish and venal in a letter he demanded printed in all Korean newspapers. They refused, and the KPR responded with a pamphlet of their own, titled The Traitors and the Patriots. In it, the KPR printed several excerpts from pro-Japanese, anti-American speeches previously given by KDP leaders, and declared the KPR as the only properly representative political body in Korea. The hodgepodge promptly banned all political pamphlets in response. On October 16th, Syngman Rhee arrived back in his homeland. As we discussed before, he had been stuck in a loop of refusals between the State and War Departments in Washington for the last month. While Hodge would later say that he was surprised by Rhee's arrival in Seoul, Rhee himself wrote in a letter shortly after his arrival that Hodge welcomed him alongside MacArthur in Tokyo on October 12th, 4 days before he finally landed in Seoul. Even if Hodge was surprised at Rhee's arrival, the hodgepodge welcomed him with open arms, putting him up at the Chosen Hotel with the highest-ranked Americans and allowing a crowd to form outside the hotel. While Rhee's biographer and close friend, Robert Oliver, would have you think this crowd was chanting Rhee's name all through the night, they really just wanted to see the man who had been bandied about as a legendary independence activist for the last 40 years or so. Curiosity, more than admiration, spread through the masses. Rhee quickly set to work manipulating the Americans into his anti-communist, pro-Korean goals. He collected leaders from the communists, conservatives, and moderates into the Central Council for the Rapid Realization of Korean Independence and declared his desire for unity. Like his future counterpart in Pyongyang, Ri was properly introduced to the Korean people at an official ceremony in recognition of their occupiers. On October 20th, Ri spoke to welcome the Americans and condemn the Soviet occupation in the north. From the same podium, Hodge spoke quite highly of the 70-year-old leader. Over the next month, Ri threw off the mask of unity, denouncing the KPR and aligning himself closely with the leadership of the KDP. It seemed that the Americans had found their man in Korea. The American occupation had an important choice to make in the fall of 1945 regarding the governance apparatus overseeing the Korean state, a choice that revolved around how to staff and structure that apparatus. The KPR showed that Koreans were fully prepared for the difficult work of building their own structure and educating themselves on the skills of governance. The Americans took the much easier and much more dangerous route of keeping the colonial bureaucracy in place in service of their traditional elitist hierarchy instead of in service of the Japanese. Although many of those traditional elites preserved their privilege during the colonial period through active collaboration with and support for their colonizers. In short, the Americans didn't really change anything. They switched some names around, but not much else. Those names that were rotated into bureaucratic positions were, much more often than not, also on the membership roster of the KDP. KDP members took up leadership positions in the criminal justice and public safety sectors, critical to enforcing their will on the state because a big part of control in statehood is who can implement a monopoly on violence and who can suppress disagreement. Whoever controls the state's police is going to most easily control that monopoly. Thus, with KDP members in those positions, their control had reached critical mass. This control could be tempered in other ways if the Americans had placed anti-KDP Koreans in other positions of power. They did not do that, with Cummings finding that if a non-KDP Korean was appointed to a position, they usually previously held a similar position in the GGK. They were a collaborator. As Koreans quickly filled formerly Japanese-held positions, they wasted no time in squashing any revolutionary energy in southern Korea. Harnessing their control of the police and the courts, they arrested or beat revolutionary activists and then charged them with arbitrary crimes, if they were charged at all. Some were just sentenced to not insignificant stints in prison. All of this was to counteract the popular support of the KPR. After its first missteps, the KPR took active steps to organize and educate the public in ways that the KDP found abhorrent. Police violence allowed the KDP to show the public that any attempt at change would be met with a boot to the face. This was easily accomplished. Back in the first episode, we talked about how GGK massively increased their police force in the early 1920s, and that police infrastructure, all the stations and substations, still existed. The hodgepodge further exacerbated this by doubling the size of the police force in the first year of the occupation and promoting those men with experience in policing. Without any context, that makes sense. You want the people in charge to be experienced in their field. The context is pretty important, though, because it shows that Korean police only got experience through working in the national police of the GGK, by working with the Japanese. In these first months, 80% of the police above the rank of patrolmen served in the colonial police force. To drive home the point that this was a distinctly American problem in the South, a great many members of the police force in the North were given money by the Japanese on the day of the surrender to flee south to Seoul, away from the Soviets. The Soviets treated former police harshly, and their only opportunity for professional advancement lay in the South with the reconstituted under another flag new national police. The tool of the oppressor stayed the same, the only thing that changed was who it served. Now, the hodgepodge did try to re-educate members of the national police in democratic ideals and civic responsibility. They also had orders to purge collaborators from the police force. They just chose not to. Anti-communism was a more necessary trait than non-collaboration. The hodgepodge actively sold out the Korean public will to more quickly achieve their goals of keeping communism at bay. Reactionary forces quickly took over and the police reverted to the totalitarian practices they learned from the Japanese. Whereas the Americans found a friend in the national police, they had trouble setting up a national armed forces. This was not part of their original mandate, but the hodgepodge, and especially Hodge specifically, stated early on that they wanted a Korean national army to take some of the weight off the shoulders of the Americans and in anticipation for the eventual creation of a Korean national government. This was reinforced by the Namwon incident of October 15th, in which violence broke out between members of the Korean Preparatory Army and the Korean National Police. In June of 1946, the Korean Constabulary was officially created from the Bureau of Armed Forces. We'll discuss that next week, though, as part of the move towards institutionalization and elections between 1946 and 1948. For the rest of today, we are going to discuss the return of the KPG, the downfall of the KPR, and the breaking apart of the consensus on a joint trusteeship of Korea. In October, George Atchison, MacArthur's political advisor in Tokyo, recommended to his superiors back in Washington that Syngman Rhee, Kim Koo, and Kim Kyu-sik take up posts in a new National Korean People's Executive Committee in Seoul. This committee would draw its legitimacy from three sources: the support of the American occupation, the background of its three leaders, and the history of the Korean Provisional Government. Since its foundation in Shanghai after the March 1st movement of 1919, the KPG has bounced around mainland China, finding itself in 1945 in Chongqing, south-central China. Now, it was preparing to return to Korea, just like all the other groups of Korean exiles and emigres. Because the American occupation had heretofore worked with a great many conservative Koreans who had too close ties to the former Japanese colonial administration, the KPG was a potential path towards political legitimacy for a future conservative Korean government. The head of the State Department's Office of Far Eastern Affairs, John Carter Vincent, wrote in reply to Atchison's recommendation, no. Vincent attempted to keep a sense of idealism in American policy towards Korea and continued to work towards trusteeship, which was still the goal of the State Department. The Department of War's response to Vincent's cable, in short, was that the hodgepodge had faced an unexpectedly fervent independence energy in Korea that, when considered with changing international priorities, required a new approach to Korea. Hodge himself later said that his goal during the autumn of 1945 was to break down the communist government of the KPR. Hodgepodge agents outside of Seoul had now gathered enough information to conclude that the KPR had effectively organized itself in most of the American zone, primarily through the People's Committees. The Hodgepodge saw this as a threat to a future Korean government beholden to the United States. The first step in ridding Korea of the KPR problem was the seizure of its primary form of communications, the newspaper Mail Sinbo. Mail Sinbo was one of three papers with modern printing presses in Seoul. The other two belonged to the Keijo Nippo, printed in Japanese, and the Chosen Printing Company, operated directly by the Hodgepodge. The Mail Sinbo was vocal in its support for the KPR and its criticism of the American occupation. On November 10th, it was shut down due to accounting errors and renamed Seoul Sinmun. This new paper, along with the re-established paper Dong-a Ilbo, which used the Keijo Nippo press, were managed by KDP leaders Ha Kyung-duk and Song Jin-woo. The KPR had lost its mouthpiece, and all of the equipment needed to counter the anti-KPR messaging was controlled by those spreading that anti-KPR message. The next step was to strip the KPR of its claims to governmental authority and make it just another political party. Yo reorganized the KPR, under the pressure of Hodge, into the People's Party on November 11th. The People's Party platform was the same as that of the KPR, but weakened the KPR by drawing away support from moderates. 10 days later, 600 KPR members from around Korea arrived in Seoul to decide the future of the KPR. They refused Hodge's demands that Republic be dropped from their name, and realized just how extensive and successful their organization had actually been throughout Korea. When Hodge asked MacArthur for advice on how to deal with a potentially revolutionary element that did not want to fall blindly in line with American demands, MacArthur demurred to Hodge's judgment and offered his loosely constrained support. On December 12th, Hodge declared the KPR unlawful, effectively ending the political prospects for the Korean People's Republic. It would stick around until February 1946, when it would join the Democratic National Front with Yo's People's Party, but it no longer had any effective claim to authority in southern Korea. In the north, the KPR's People's Committees were co-opted by the Soviets to form the local units of their occupation. The banner of social and political revolution would have to be carried by others from here on out. By late November, American Korea policy had begun to shift away from trusteeship and towards a permanent division. In a cable from William Langdon, a State Department advisor in Seoul, the KPG was the only viable option for governing Korea, at least in an interim capacity. Langdon lays out a 6-step process for transitioning Korea from occupation to independence. 1. Kim Koo forms an advisory council called the Governing Commission that would serve as the seed from which an indigenous government would sprout. 2. The Governing Commission would integrate into the hodgepodge. 3. The GC would take over daily administration from the hodgepodge, with Hodge retaining veto power over GC decisions. 4. Those powers that would have been a part of the trusteeship would be given some positions for advisors, but Americans would still hold the lion's share of advisory positions. 5. The GC would choose a head of state. And 6. The new head of state would form a government and receive international recognition from other states and the United Nations. Importantly, placing another nail in the coffin of indefinite division, Langdon states that, if the Soviets choose not to cooperate, this process should still take place in the American zone of southern Korea. All of this is because, paraphrasing from Langdon, the old native regime was corrupt, but it was best disposed toward foreign interests. I am sure that we may count on at least as much from a native government evolved as above. End quote. The primary American goal had moved from the internationalists' ideal of trusteeship to the nationalists' ideal of limiting the spread of communism. This move was further cemented by the arranged arrival of Kim Koo's conservatives in the KPG, with the Americans actively working with Kim to ensure that the non-conservative factions of the KPG would not arrive in Seoul for some time. This ensured that conservatives would remain at the top of the pyramid in Seoul until they could further entrench themselves into the still-forming power structure that would, one day, become a South Korean government. Before the end of the war against Japan, the United States and the Soviet Union did not reach an agreement on trusteeship, which is why they hastily decided that a temporary division and occupation was a good idea. Between December 16th and December 27th, the American, British, and Soviet foreign ministers met in Moscow to discuss the issue of Korea, along with all the other problems they couldn't resolve before war's end. In Moscow, a rare thing was achieved: post-war unity. The 3 attendees agreed that a 4-power trusteeship should be implemented in Korea for up to 5 years. This agreement came after an American proposal and a Soviet counterproposal. The American proposal would implement a joint administration of the American and Soviet military that would then be replaced by a 4-power trusteeship until Korean independence, expected to occur after 5 years. The Soviet counterproposal would implement a joint commission made up of American and Soviet military officers who would assist in the formation of a provisional Korean government. Trusteeship was not actually deemed necessary in the Soviet counterproposal, and would only be considered after the creation of the provisional government and the Joint Commission. The Soviet proposal was accepted by the Americans and British, and published as their official resolution to the issue of Korea. It is more of a shock that the Americans accepted the proposal than it is that the Soviets brushed off trusteeship. It potentially reflects the fact that, by this point, the Americans were leaning away from a unified Korea anyway, and were just keen to reach any resolution on Korea so they could discuss more important topics. But I doubt that the sentiments expressed by Hodge and MacArthur had fully filtered through to Secretary of State James Burns by this point. Internationally, the response was one of praise for reaching agreement. In Korea, the response was much more varied and much more negative. Joint administration, even through the Joint Commission, was not supported in any way by the KDP. The Americans had propped them up to this point, and their future lay with a continued, unilateral American occupation of southern Korea. To introduce the Soviets into southern Korea could unravel the web of misinformation the conservatives had woven up to this point. On December 29th, Song Jin-woo met Hodge to discuss the Moscow Agreement and, one day later, was shot dead by a far-right terrorist because of his support for tutelage, even if it was not through a joint trusteeship but through an American-led tutelage. Again, trusteeship had long been the policy of the United States. It was also only mentioned in the 3rd paragraph of the Moscow Agreement concerning Korea, and only then as a Plan B option. Because of this sudden backlash against trusteeship in any form, Hodge reversed course and began opposing trusteeship himself. Despite pointing this out to his Korean colleagues that a Korean government would be built before trusteeship would occur, Hodge still actively worked to build anti-trusteeship sentiment among Koreans and with MacArthur. Conservative Koreans took this one step further and began blaming the idea of trusteeship on the Soviets, directly contradicting all the evidence that it was an American idea. In the final days of 1945, Kim Koo attempted to subvert the hodgepodge in an easily subdued coup. For his anti-occupation efforts, he got a stern talking to from Hodge. Kim's failed coup, along with the hodgepodge's active efforts to discredit the KPR, took all the wind out of the apolitical independence movement. From here on out, independence efforts coming from Seoul were led by Ri and the KDP, and became distinctly anti-Soviet, even though any trusteeship of Korea would be both Soviet and American. The KDP's independence leadership was almost entirely built on lies. Ri, in a radio address on December 17th, said that Soviet Koreans wanted to make Korea a part of the Soviet Union, that the Soviets wanted to divide Korea, and that if, quote, we do not solve this problem through our own efforts, our country will be divided in two and we will not be able to avoid civil war. How prescient. Also, Korea was already divided. That was already happening. On December 27th, the KDP published materials again blaming the Soviets for trusteeship proposals by misquoting publications from the earlier Yalta Conference. Finally, on January 10, 1946, a KDP newspaper was published with the headline, Soviets Advocate Trusteeship, U.S. Advocates Immediate Independence. That second part just was not true. It was all just a load of baloney, and the hodgepodge did nothing but go along with it, further accelerating the KDP's campaign to discredit their more popular and well-organized opposition. This campaign was another step in the process of cementing the primacy of the KDP in South Korean politics. The KDP ramped up this campaign during and after the Moscow Conference because any Korean government under joint Soviet-American oversight would likely be a moderate coalition. This was a fight for survival for the KDP, and it gave the KDP a reason to exist in the political mind of Koreans. They leaned into their anti-communist policies and began proclaiming that any joint occupation or trusteeship would be controlled by the Soviets. This increased the support for the KDP within the hodgepodge and wider American government, as well as within the Korean public because of two events. First, allegedly, the Soviets ordered Southern communists to support the Moscow Agreement, which was a reversal of their previous stance. This evidence comes from a message issued by the North Pyongyang Provincial Committee of the Korean Communist Party that was taken off a communist agent attempting to cross the 38th parallel in April 1946. That there was no such place as North Pyongyang was not a concern of those in charge in Seoul. It was clear evidence that they were right when they accused the leftists and communists of being controlled by the Soviets back in January when those parties originally began to switch their support to the Moscow Agreement. That their support was driven by a recognition that a moderate coalition under a joint commission would be beneficial to their politics is the logical reason for moderates and communists shifting their support. It turns out that Moscow did tell the Southern communists to support the Moscow Agreement, but this would not be found out until much later, when Soviet documents were declassified in the 1990s. The second event that doomed the Moscow Agreement in Korea was an ill-timed press conference and was entirely the fault of one Richard Johnston, the New York Times correspondent in Seoul. Johnston very falsely claimed that Pak Han-yong, leader of the Korean Communist Party, advocated for the Soviet Union to take total control of Korea and absorb it into the USSR as a Korean Soviet Socialist Republic. This was a bald-faced lie, and was discredited by every other American and Korean reporter present at the press conference. Hodge lent Johnston his support, and the Times made no effort to publish a retraction or correction. I don't know why Johnston did this, but it was either that he was just a bad reporter, or he was actively trying to put his finger on the levers of Korean politics, which would also make him a bad reporter. Pak came out of this incident branded a Soviet sympathizer more than a Korean leader, and this false charge tainted him for the rest of his career. Through all of this, the Soviets are looking on incredulously. An agreement had been reached in Moscow, and now the Americans were stepping back from it. It's no small thing that this would become a wedge that further drives the two former allies apart at the beginning of the Cold War. Between September 1945 and January 1946, Soviet goals in Korea were to gain just enough influence on the peninsula to secure their interests of a secure border near Vladivostok and a weak Japan that can no longer challenge them in Asia. In the words of Catherine Weathersby, Stalin wanted to balance competing interests in Korea and was willing to wait and see what the Americans proposed before making a concrete decision on the best course of action. There is no evidence that the Soviets directed any anti-American efforts south of the 38th in late 1945. In fact, they actively encouraged the KCP leadership to cooperate with the hodgepodge. The Soviets also wrote out multiple potential paths for an independent, unified Korea, but these were rendered impossible once the American-anointed KDP turned decidedly against the Soviets. Heading into Moscow, the Soviets had a genuine desire to create a unified government that was controlled by Koreans and friendly to both the Soviets and the Americans. Remember, the Soviets' main concern was a resurgent Japan. They could still accomplish their goals of removing Japanese influence from Korea under a Korean government. The Americans did not share that goal, though, and were actively empowering formerly pro-Japanese Koreans in the South. So, as the calendar rolls over from 1945 to 1946, we have the Soviets advocating for an American idea, the Americans placing the former agents of their enemy in power, and Koreans of all political stripes finding ways to wag the dog. It was bound to happen that someone would get left behind. It is just unfortunate, then, that those left behind turned out to be the moderates that offered Korea the best chance at a unified independence. Before we end, let's talk about the title for this accidental two-part episode run. This week's title completes the phrase, "The eye of the master maketh the horse fat." It's kind of the inverse of "the mice will play when the cat's away." For our situation, though, it more closely matches the idea that within the first few months of division and occupation, both the Soviets and the Americans, the masters, had found their horse and were starting to do whatever they could to place their horse at the top of the heap. The attention of the master was leading to just one horse getting all the benefits of power, with the others wasting away to oblivion or actively beaten down. It's imperfect, but it captures the similarities between the American and Soviet occupations. And that's where we'll leave our discussion for now, with the drive for trusteeship breaking down and both the Americans and Soviets entrenching themselves into their respective zones of occupation. Next week, we'll speed things up a bit and discuss peninsular affairs up until the election of 1948. If you're on social media, you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook as @CTCA Podcast. If you're not on social media, you can find more information, including the references for today's episode, at ctcapodcast.libsyn.com. That's ctcapodcast.libsyn.com. We release new episodes every Tuesday. Please be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Deezer, or wherever you listen to podcasts. I am Trevor Owens, and this is Coming Together, Coming Apart. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have an enjoyable week.